today's little snippet where we're going to solve all the binding problems of the world. Am I right? Aren't we all looking for a binding solution, ways to make binding easier? Yes, we are. Okay, as always, we've got to give YouTube a moment to let people know that we're here. There's a few of you that were waiting, which I so appreciate. But we'll give a few more people a chance to join up. It usually takes 45 or 50 seconds for it to happen. So we're having another gorgeous, gorgeous day in the Inland Northwest. I'm thinking it's a day for a bike ride, perhaps. Anyway, yeah. What are you working on today in your studio? As the comments start coming in, which also takes time, I will see them, but I'd love to know what you're working at today. There we go. Sue's joining in. Fantastic. That's the only comment I see so far. Okay, today's topic. Fairy quilts cut alive, yes. Today's topic, binding solved, is my thumbnail. I don't know that I can solve every binding problem in one short issue, but I can solve a couple of the issues with today's short chat. And I want to talk about applying binding on the long arm. And it is a partial application because really you can only easily apply binding to the top of the quilt, the portion that is exposed. This is ideal, however, if you like to hand stitch down the backside of your binding, or if in fact you want to do this for clients, if you do quilting as a business. So a couple of things that make it handy. One is when you're working on a big quilt, as I am today, and yesterday on June, the 6th, I did a live stream of this quilt, so there's more details on it then, but it's about 90 by 100, a little over 100. And so a big quilt like this is difficult to apply binding at your sewing machine just because it's so huge. Where do you go with the whole thing at the table and it's always hanging down on one side or the other and pulling, and right? Or you're wrangling it with your shoulders and it's literally fatiguing. So the huge advantage then to doing it at the long arm is it's already up here flat and you don't have to hold it up at all. You can just lay your binding on top and stitch it down. If you have done particularly your top and bottom with the channel lock or with your belts engaged, as I did on mine, you can actually just line up your binding and zip along in that perfectly straight line, and it goes really quickly, let me tell you. So there's a couple real advantages to applying the binding on the long arm. Now, what do you need to do that? You need a straight ruler to help you get an accurate line. Again, I like a good quality binding. Like I want it to be even on there. I want it to be the same width the whole way down. So the first important step to that is getting an even seam allowance. And so your ruler is key for that. And then of course you will need a ruler plate. You can see that I've got one on Stella here because you're doing ruler work in effect, right? Beyond that, you need no specialty equipment. And it doesn't really matter what your width of binding is, you just need to determine what your seam allowance width will be. I like to do my bindings at 2 1/4 inches, so I do a 1/4 inch seam allowance. This binding was already made for me, it's 2 1/2. So I'm gonna take an ever so slightly generous 1/4 inch seam allowance on this one. So you'll have to determine that for yourself, but really ruler and ruler plate is all the special equipment that you need. You see that I've got a empty thread cone here. I do this at my sewing machine too, because I sometimes apply bindings there, and I just drop my binding over it. And when I'm working at the long arm, it just helps. You can see that. When I pull on it, usually, it just kind of spins around on that spool and keeps it more in place and without getting too messy and fraying the edges too badly. So that's just a kind of a little side tip. So let's see what comments we're getting. Good morning, Cynthia, Janice, Anne, Patricia, Carol, Daphne, Gabrielle. Some of you have joined in so many times over this last month, and it is just fun to tune in from you. Shirley, also from France. Angie, no actual quilting today, just finished a cute bucket style hat. Ooh, that sounds fun. Robin Edda in Austria, wonderful. Angela, piecing a Wensleydale quilt, and I have my great-grandma's Dresden plate quilt on the long arm. Too fun. Okay, feel free to chime in on this binding idea. Did you even know you can bind on a long arm? Is it something you think you might like to try? So the only equipment, as I said, that you need is ruler and ruler plate. Beyond that, it's very similar to doing at your home sewing machine. So for example, when you come to a corner and you want to fold and miter that corner, right? With my long arm, I just stitch off to the edge a little bit, just like I do at my sewing machine, do the folding, get it in place, often put a pin or two in it, and then just start stitching back over again with the long arm. So it's just basically like stitching it on with the giant sewing machine. The only thing that I do differently is when I start, and I've just started right here, I do leave a tail, and I'm going to work my way all the way around, lapping the quilt. So I will have to advance and rewind the quilt, right, as I do it. And when I come back around, I leave a generous tail, and then I dismount from the long arm, and I do that final mitered join of those two ends at my sewing machine. Years ago, I had a friend we call her the MacGyver of quilting because she's always figuring out how to do the hard things. She figured out how to do that mitered seam at the long arm, but it literally involves like having a stiff piece of paper, figuring out where your seam has to be, pinning the two ends to the paper, holding the paper, doing the stitching. That, to me, that's more work. I'd rather just take those two tails and do that last little bit, sew that little seam, finish attaching the binding at my domestic sewing machine. So that's how I personally do it. Someone asked about binding at the long arm yesterday, and I was honest, and I will be today too. I don't always apply at the long arm, partly because if I'm fully binding for a client, then I will apply the binding to the back of the quilt, bring it around to the front and top stitch it by machine. I don't hand stitch bindings for other people, right? So you need to know what you prefer, but just know that this is an option. And I do have some clients for whom I attach binding and then they do the hand stitching afterwards. Okay, Janice, I might try on my next big quilt. Yeah, it is a shoulder saver. It really, really is. Carol finished one customer quilt, loading another. Foxy's vacation, hello from North State, California. Donna. Anya from the Netherlands. Awesome. We've got the world well represented here today. This is fun. Well, I've been coming live Monday through Saturday for the last, I think, 4 weeks, each day in the morning. And so this is kind of a fitting last one, right, to do the binding, the sort of finishing touch on a quilt. This has been so fun, and I know I'll do it again when I launch my free motion quilting masterclass again. But since I've been talking about that all this week too, enrollment officially closed last night, but almost every time I do a launch, a few people are still asking me questions or email me, and I wake up the next morning and have a few emails, can I still get in? And so, yes, indeed, I have kept enrollment open until this evening now, so it's about 8 more hours from now. So if you still have any questions or want to read about it or want to email me and ask anything, you do still have that little opportunity today. Free Motion Quilting Masterclass is a lot of free motion designs, over 25 of them, taught in step-by-step detail. One of them is the flames that I quilted on this firefighter's t-shirt quilt behind me here. There's a wide variety. There's loopy things, there's wavy things, there's Baptist fans, there's paisleys and flowers and flames and all kinds of stuff, mod boxes. So a whole portfolio of designs, and I really tried to build into it showing you my thought processes. Some of these designs have evolved over time, and what made them not work well, and what made me want to change them, and how did I change, or what did I change to make them more either user-friendly or graceful looking or whatever, so that you can then take your ideas and tweak them, right? And create your own original work. So you've got a portfolio of 27 or 8 designs, but also you can add to that your own flourishes on them or your own completely original design. So I try to be forward thinking in that, teaching you to fish so you can get your own dinner. You can find your own quilting ideas and designs everywhere. Let's see. Eden, what's your thoughts of folding the binding edges in and overlapping it on the long arm? So I think you mean when the beginning and end join. I think you absolutely could, Eden. It would involve planning ahead a little bit to have those raw edges pressed in place, right? And often to have still that bias or that mitered fold. I like to have that joining seam on a 45. I don't like my join to be straight across because you get such bulk then, right? But if you think ahead through that, absolutely. I've seen others on YouTube showing how to kind of just tuck one inside the other and then stitch over it. Yeah, absolutely. I think that would be an option for sure. Terry, hello. Yolanda, also from the Netherlands. Fantastic. Linda is working on a double square star. Angela, if I was able to join the masterclass, do I have to be on the live calls or is it a self-paced class? The class material is all self-paced, all pre-recorded. It all opens for you at once and it never expires. The live portions are just in support, right? Entirely optional. The Facebook group, entirely optional. It's just in support of if you want it. And Donna's hello from Saskatchewan. Patricia, masterclass is amazing. Thank you for that. Appreciate it. Okay, any other questions about the binding? Otherwise, I got to get on with the thing. And I'm going to tell you guys, because I believe in being honest. I sewed a corner of this here so I could show you today. But the truth of the matter is I am fully binding this quilt for this client. So I'm actually going to take it off. I just basted it on and I'm going to take it off, and I am going to do it at my sewing machine. Following what I told you a few moments ago, I'm going to sew it on the wrong side of the quilt, press it, and stitch it around to the front with top stitching. Part of the reason also that I need to do that this time is yesterday on the live I showed you that the backing was not quite wide enough, like actually a tiny bit narrower than the quilt. So I sewed an extender on for the purposes of holding things snug, but I'm actually having to trim. I'm losing just a little bit of probably 3/8 of an inch of actual quilt. And I need to see that from the wrong side to see where that join is to be sure I don't have any of my funky little extender showing in the backing of the quilt, right? So I either need to trim it up first, which is probably what I'll do, or at least be able to see that when I'm sewing from the wrong side. So all these things factor into your decision of what's the best for me today on this quilt, right? But I just wanted you to know that the binding at the long arm is a great option. And even when I stitch the second side, I always stitch the first side at the front, then I flip it over with a bit of overlap and stitch in the ditch at the front side with the domestic. Yep, that's a perfectly acceptable way too. I feel like binding is, there are many ways, right? Many ways to accomplish that. And it's worthwhile trying a couple of them to find what you like best. I definitely have a system worked out for my full machine binding. That's what I do for most of my quilts anymore too, because it's so much faster. And I do a lot of stuff, including make a lot of quilts, right? And better for me to have them 100% machine bound than to not get them done, right? So that's my personal preference. But in terms of what comes first or what comes last, or whether you like top stitching on the front or stitching in the ditch, like that's all personal preferences to, you know, where the seam lines show and what you like the look of. I will give you one tip that I think is invaluable no matter which way you do it, and that's this. When your binding is sewn on to the quilt and before it's wrapped around, whether it's front or back, I take it to my ironing board, my ironing block. I have a great big one, and I press it. I open that seam and press it, and then the fold is much easier to manage. So I can do my 100% machine binding, do that second top stitching part without needing to pin or clip it, because the binding, I don't know how to describe it, but the binding is pressed flat open. I'm not always trying to pull that seam allowance open, if that makes sense. So I've found that few minutes that it takes to press it really helps make my job easier of doing the second row of stitching and gets me a crisper, neater, more consistent width and result. So that's a worthwhile thing, I think, to add into your binding. Gabrielle, how is the beginning connected to the end? I did talk about that just a moment ago. I leave a tail and I lap all the way around the quilt and leave a tail again, and then I dismount the quilt off the long arm and I go finish that last join and the last little finishing up of the binding at my domestic sewing machine. That's my preference. Someone else asked here, couldn't you have those raw edges folded in, slip one inside the other, and finish at the long arm? Absolutely, you could do that too. You just got to think ahead and figure that process out. Janice, I press two. Yep, so worthwhile. Helen, never did binding like that, but going to give it a try. Thank you. I do think it's worth a try. I absolutely do, and especially if you do multiple, applying of binding for clients. I think you could get really, really fast at this, right? And it could be a valuable service because a lot of people get hung up. It's a bottleneck getting your quilts bound, right? So if you do it as a business, I think it's a superb complimentary service to offer, but even for yourself. I was going to say earlier, we were talking about there's all these different ways that you can bind quilts. Equally good, just whatever suits you. At some point in my quilting journey, this is quite a few years ago, I was definitely struggling with binding in terms of no two quilts came out quite the same. You know, do I miter this way? Like, should I pull this a little tighter? What? And at some point, I ended up with 4 or 5 quilts that I bound one right after another, boom, 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 boom. And that actually really helped because I didn't forget what worked for me last time, right? I really kind of worked out that system. So I mentioned earlier, I do all my bindings. I cut them at 2 1/4. And so I know exactly how wide my seam allowance needs to be to give me enough to wrap around, to top stitch it the way that I like. And just doing several quilts in quick succession helped me nailed that down, and now I sort of never forget it. And it's kind of comical because I talk about this in my free motion quilting masterclass all the time. When you're learning a quilting design, it's really valuable to do it on more than one quilt if you possibly can manage it. It takes a little bit of time, like for that shape memory, those movements to sort of settle into your memory, and also you like figure things out, like how big do I want my circles, right? And if you do it on several quilts in succession, that just solidifies it, and then you sort of never forget it, like riding your bike, you never forget it. And that design now is yours, you own it. So I'm a real proponent of that. When you're learning a new design, whatever it may be, practice it a bunch and then put it on several quilts, just one right after another. And it will just really cement it in your learning process. Okay, I think that's all the comments. Listen, everyone, thank you so much for joining. Oh, and there's Zandra. Zandra, tell me how to say your name at some point. I don't know when I'll hear you say it, but nice to see you. We have Sweden and the Netherlands and Austria and I think Germany, definitely France. This is so cool. Thank you so much for joining me on all these morning snippets. And do know that I have put them all in a playlist. I think it's called May/June 2025. Daily snippets. So if you want to go back and watch them at any time, you can do that. They will just continue to live on YouTube for a while. Thank you for joining me. It's been a real pleasure. Nancy, quilting today on my Q20. Lovely, lovely, lovely. Well, I wish you all the best in your quilting journey, and I'm going to get back to binding this giant of a quilt and get it off to my client. Oh, Eden, South Africa too. Fabulous. So this is so great. I love having the whole world represented here. What a great community we quilters are. All right, you guys, have a great rest of the day, and I will catch up with you soon.